Good afternoon. I hope this finds everybody healthy and doing well. We resume now our series on legal issues arising from COVID-19. And today we focus on international law issues arising from it. And we're so fortunate to have two of our professors to speak on this issue. As I've done in past weeks, I'll only do a very brief introduction. It doesn't begin to do justice to all their many accomplishments. I'm sure that everybody's already familiar with both of these distinguished professors. Laurel Fletcher received an undergraduate degree from Brandeis, a law degree from Harvard. She's had a distinguished career doing international human rights work. She's co-director of International Human Rights Clinic, and she's also co-director of the Miller Institute. And doing this presentation with her is her fellow co-director of the Miller Institute, Katerina Linos. She has an undergraduate degree from Harvard, a diploma for the European University Institute, a JD and a PhD from Harvard, very distinguished career as an academic, including doing prize-winning scholarship in areas of international law. She's professor of law, and it's with that short introduction, which doesn't, again, do justice here, I thank both of you for doing this presentation and really look forward to listening.
So it's a huge pleasure to see so many familiar faces. Dean Chemerinsky and I were debating whether or not anyone would be interested after exams were over, but it turns out that many faculty and staff and students are here. It's a huge honor to listen to have you participate in this conversation. So Whitney, if you could turn to our first slide. So we're in the middle of a pandemic, and of course, there are all kinds of items that we need. So I thought I'd start by explaining what it is that we had set up prior, what the system of global health governance looks like, starting with the World Health Organization. Whitney, could we go to the next slide, please? So the World Health Organization, which has been in the news extensively, is meeting today. We have the state representatives discussing how best to address the pandemic. The goal is to fight all kinds of health issues, but infectious diseases are at the core. To the extent the WHO has been active on other issues, it has one treaty, tobacco control treaty, and all kinds of other efforts. But one way of putting our investment in global health coordination in perspective is by looking at the WHO budget. This budget, again, has been in the news, with President Trump threatening to cut 400,000 from the US contribution, President Xi promising 2 billion. The total WHO annual budget is on the order of 4 to 5 billion. In comparison, health expenses at the national level are huge. Just the NIH, just one important US agency, but nothing close to the total US health budget, has a budget 10 times as high as the WHO. So when we're thinking about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of global organizations, we might want to think of what they're doing with very little money and what it is that they're able to accomplish given their staffing, their resources, their expertise, and their status. So one peculiar feature of the World Health Organization is that it is staffed by doctors and public health experts. Most international organizations are staffed with experts in other capacities. So there's some international organizations that have lawyers, and those international organizations sometimes pursue adversarial strategies, naming and shaming. Other international organizations, such as the World Bank and the IMF, are staffed by economists. And there's a different strategy where budgets, incentives are critical to the operation. The WHO essentially does what it does through its epistemic, information-based scientific expertise. With a budget of 4 billion, there's not a lot it can do It can't even fund its own investigation teams. When the WHO sends scientists, they're basically relying on volunteer teams, such as those sent by the US, the CDC in Atlanta staffs a lot of the volunteers. So all they can really do is bring together scientists, have their calls picked up on and their messages amplified by media around the world. They pursued a different strategy and they've been criticized for this. Unlike organizations in the human rights field, organizations that Professor Fletcher will be discussing, they don't go around saying this member state, that member state is behaving in a way that's inconsistent with our charter or mission. They instead have been praising the Chinese response, and this is the topic I'll turn to next. But in short, the WHO is a small UN agency. It operates on a small-ish budget. The US has been criticizing it recently, but this criticism did not begin with the Trump administration. About a decade ago, the US and other Western leaders set up something like a competitor body called the Global Fund. They thought the WHO was not progressing fast enough on infectious diseases such as malaria and tuberculosis and thought they could circumvent the WHO. That did not work out as well as expected. But these problems are longstanding, and I'll move on to a different topic, but just say to the extent there are questions about the WHO, Professor Fletcher and I will be addressing them in Q&A. Can we, Whitney, could we move on to the next slide? So let's talk a little bit about what it is that the WHO has succeeded in doing and failed in doing. Some of the biggest killers, some of the biggest scourges of the world are diseases that have almost been eradicated or have been completely been eradicated, and the WHO is credited for some of this success. Another epidemic, which is now viewed as successfully resolved, is SARS. SARS only killed about 8,000 people. And even though at the time, lawyers were very upset with what the WHO was doing, in part because Chinese sovereignty was not being respected by these enterprising doctors who were just sneaking in and getting samples, at the end of the day, this is seen as a successfully addressed epidemic. To the extent the WHO has been even more ambitious in addressing global causes of death, diseases that kill millions of people annually, there is the smoking treaty that many believe has dramatically changed advertising around the world, but has not succeeded in reducing the amount of smoking in the developing world. Finally, a topic that comes up today extensively are the international health regulations. So the international health regulations are commonly agreed upon standards on what member states owe one another at times like these, how they need to notify one another and how they need to act in epidemics. To me, when I read these, I am underwhelmed, and I'm underwhelmed because the core obligation, the obligation that China is alleged to have failed to meet, is to report on health emergencies promptly. So government is supposed to report to the WHO within 24 hours of when it believes an epidemic that may have global implications begins. Then the WHO can make recommendations about how the government should address this epidemic and how other governments must address it as well, for example, by imposing or not imposing travel restrictions. But all states are obliged to do is to consider WHO recommendations in good faith. So this is a system that is low budget, it's based on voluntary cooperation, it's based on the status of doctors and the coherence of medical training and public health training around the world. So seen in that light, we might evaluate the WHO somewhat more generously than the current administration does. Whitney, could we go on to the next slide? So who is responsible for the current situation? The Trump administration, an administration that has led this country through about a quarter of the reported deaths, says it is China's fault. And there is certainly much to be criticized in the Chinese response, as well as some to be praised. So the WHO Director General, Tedros Ghebreyesus, repeatedly praises China, perhaps too early, and has said that the Chinese response in February, so the Chinese response in January, in which China denied the existence of the disease, and as Professor Fletcher will report, silenced those who were eager to give out early warnings, is different from the Chinese response in February. So China put in place extraordinary quarantines, which might have violated human rights in dramatic ways, but WHO Director General says they bought the rest of the world a month of time, which is critical at the beginning of a pandemic. This worldview is not shared by the Trump administration or by closely aligned governors in the states of Missouri and Mississippi, or by groups of private plaintiffs. And right now, there are a variety of civil suits in US courts in which it is alleged that all kinds of downstream consequences from COVID and the closures, the death, and the economic harm are due to Chinese action and inaction. This litigation is unlikely to succeed because it faces both procedural and substantive hurdles. The Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act makes it very difficult to sue a state like China. It has a few exceptions for states we really don't like, as well as for commercial activity and torts that happen in the United States. But to most international lawyers who specialize in this area, it seems unlikely that this first hurdle of allowing these plaintiffs to bring a sovereign state before US courts to begin defending itself will be overcome. What is also troubling in these claims against China is the content of the allegation. There are false theories and rumors and entirely extravagant facts out there that perhaps there was a Wuhan laboratory that was building biological weapons. And if that were the set of facts, then perhaps a claim could be made. However, to the extent the more believable allegations have to do with China neglecting to notify the world in a timely manner, suppressing dissidents, delaying in putting in place key measures, it seems that the obligations the international system has are thin. It seems that affirmative duties China has to other nations are not very clearly established. Because these legal obstacles are evident to many, there are currently bills in Congress that seek both to establish a new exception to sovereign immunity to address the procedural challenges, as well as a new cause of action to allow suits against foreign states that would cover recklessness. But I don't believe that those statutes are likely to be passed. So if China is not at fault, then who is? I'd love to discuss this further in Q&A, but I'll ask Whitney to pass on to the next slide so we can raise some other issues related to international responses. Something governments around the world have implemented are border closures. And what this map shows, which is a little dated, is that both complete closures and partial closures are extraordinarily common. These are restrictions on the movement of people. The movement of goods has not been restricted dramatically, other than through supply chain interruptions, less so through customs and other kinds of regulations on trade. The movement of animals, which has been restricted in prior pandemics, has also not been restricted to the extent we believe human to human transmission rather than human to animal to human transmission is what's working on. at present. Whitney, if you could move on to the next slide so that I can talk a little bit more about what these border closures entail. So starting with the Cold War era, Western states strongly preferred using entrance bans rather than exit bans. It was a point of Western pride that we allowed our dissidents to flee, and that's how international law is written. Most countries in the world have closed their borders to new entrants. They've allowed citizens and permanent residents to enter, sometimes, often actually, after following periods of mandatory quarantine, but have stopped non-residents from entering. There are a few countries, notably the Czech Republic and Cuba, that are restricting exit. Now, even though citizens can return, as can residents, there are all kinds of practical problems to travel right now. For instance, transit countries might have their own restrictions. There are few flights. Family members may not all hold the same citizenship status. And of course, quarantines are costly. In addition, there are visa processing problems, all kinds of things we don't consider in regular times. The coronavirus and the subsequent response have brought to light. This administration has put in place all kinds of policies that it intended to try anyway. So to the extent a travel ban had been a goal of the Trump administration from day one and a key goal of the campaign, now it is a reality. And in fact, the most recent efforts of the Trump administration in the area of immigration actually have to do with entirely legal immigrants. The most recent proclamation focuses on people who would be otherwise eligible for green cards, but have some other kind of status. And the Trump administration has put up a temporary moratorium on the issuance of green cards for persons who are physically outside of the United States right now, in addition to the travel bans. The implications of closed borders, the implications of COVID-19 are huge for everyone, but they're especially large for vulnerable population. One set of populations that relies on open border in order to preserve their life are refugees. By definition, a refugee is a person who crosses a border because he or she fears that their life is in danger. And right now, that is not an option. So the US has closed both its northern and southern border to asylum applicants on public health grounds. This is the case for dozens of countries around the world. This would have been outrageous before COVID. So Greece closed its borders to asylum applicants on March 1st, and everybody protested because it wasn't, the rationale was something other than public health. And when dozens of countries did so a week later, nobody protested, even though the humanitarian consequences are similar. Resettlement programs in which countries move from one set of camps in a temporary destination, such as Kenya or Tanzania, to the US or Canada have also been completely stopped. And at the same time, the conditions in which migrants and refugees often live, camp conditions, are unsanitary at many times, but especially dangerous at times of epidemics. We have seen we've seen COVID cases in camps, in Rohingya camps in Bangladesh. We've seen COVID cases in detention camps here on the US border and in many other locations. So on that sad note, I will pass on to Professor Fletcher, who will tell us that all of our liberties are threatened.
On that uplifting note, thank you, Professor Linos. So just to give a sense of the global reach of the pandemic, and I know that many of us are panic scrolling through our Twitter feeds and Facebook and New York Times updates, but just to remind us, there are, as of today, 4.8 million cases of COVID worldwide, confirmed cases. The actual number is likely much higher. About a little over 300,000 confirmed deaths. And as Professor Linos says, the United States is responsible for about a quarter of those. And the pandemic is reaching 216 countries. The pandemic, it does create a public health emergency, and governments are invoking exceptional authority to take measures to protect public health and to control the spread of the virus and treat those who are sick. So this slide lists some of the restrictions, some of the common restrictions that we're seeing around the world. And as Professor Linos says, I started off with the border closures. I think, you know, why I wanted to start with this is that this list, we are now familiar and ourselves are experiencing many of these same restrictions here in the United States. And generally in the United States, we haven't seen much pushback against the restrictions until quite recently, and those have been a smattering of protests. And it's interesting in the United States that the protests that we're seeing are generally from politically conservative groups. I saw one placard that said, "Jesus is my vaccine," as a way to promote, to fight back against stay-at-home, shelter-in-place restrictions. And the objections are primarily about the economic impact of the shutdown and people wanting to get back to work, wanting to support their families, wanting to open businesses. But some of the protests in the United States have been in response to news reports that the Trump administration was going to use cell phone tracking data to fight the pandemic. Now, I know that Professor Urban in the next one of these lectures is going to be talking about surveillance, biosurveillance, and tracking. So I'm not going to go into that, but I think that to me that was significant because that was the first kind of just concrete discursive framing in the United States from a kind of popular protest, framing opposition to government regulation on a rights-based framework. But what we're seeing worldwide is a human rights crisis as well. And the speed and the scale of government restrictions is really staggering. And from a human rights perspective, what activists and scholars are concerned about is that under using the COVID pandemic, states are initiating very broad and potentially discriminatory sets of regulations. And the discriminatory, both in terms of who is impacted by the regulations and or because government authorities are applying these restrictions to target vulnerable groups or politically unpopular groups. So for example, I was speaking with an activist in Uganda who was explaining the president has enacted emergency regulations, which include criminal penalties for anyone who does not wear a face mask in public. And in a country where many people are living hand to mouth day to day, they simply can't afford the personal protective gear to comply with that order. So what does that mean? It sets up a situation which is just ripe for low-level endemic corruption and harassment to exact bribes from members of the public who are just trying to go about their business. And that's just one small illustration of the ways in which what seem like common sense protective measures can be implemented in ways that have negative human rights consequences. So Whitney, go ahead and advance the slide. The question this raises more generally then, so what is the international human rights framework that applies to these kinds of government restrictions? The human rights treaty system allows for states to restrict rights in a few different ways. So in normal times, without an emergency, human rights treaties by their terms permit limitations on certain fundamental rights, right? Like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. And the framework, the regulatory framework, is one that really is trying to permit governments to make trade-offs among rights and to set up a system of reasonable restrictions to accommodate conflicting rights, with the overarching purpose that there should be a human rights protection regime in place to maximize human rights freedoms and to minimize their restrictions. So the overarching aim is about promoting stable democratic forms of government with appropriate checks and balances. With that in mind, the guidelines are that limitations have to be necessary, they have to be narrowly tailored, be the least restrictive alternative for impinging on rights. There has to be proportionality between the means and the objectives. And so all of those are just some doctrinal limitations. And then there's some what we would call just sort of, structural constitutional limitations, which is that the regulatory framework is one that applies under constitutional processes. So every nation is going to have that designed slightly differently, but there's some measure of checks and balances. If in the United States, we have Congress is going to adopt the laws. There's a dialogue between the executive and Congress. We have judicial oversight. And through those normal processes, the idea is that states are able to regulate them in the first instance. And then if there are problems, then the international framework kicks in, and there's a system of review because states need to file periodic reports with treaty bodies, and therefore treaty monitoring bodies are able to offer their opinion and advice whether state is out of compliance with its treaty obligations in enacting this type of regulation. There can also be human rights courts will also are able to take up individual petitions that challenge these kinds of restrictions. So that's what exists in normal times, but we're not in normal times. And in states of emergency, human rights treaties allow states to derogate, meaning that they are restricting, they're able to say, we are going to derogate from our treaty obligations for a limited purpose. And the limited purpose is because the state is facing a threat to its core functions, and we need to take exceptional measures to address the core emergency. This will be done on a temporary basis, and then we will restore full enjoyment of the rights. And so, like limitations, the requirements are that states need to be doing this in a legitimate fashion. They needs to be done according to fundamental principles of fairness, necessity, proportionality, and that when states do this, a further measure of oversight is that states are supposed to provide notification to other states that they are in fact derogating. And that is thought to be some measure of inducement that states aren't going to be overly broad in these, because they have to notify others, and there's a sense that states want to be seen to be law-abiding within the international community. And so that very simple measure of notification is one of the structural breaks in the international system. And it's not just notification, but once they notify, then treaty bodies have the opportunity to review the derogation and make essentially a declaratory statement about whether those derogations are consistent with the treaty obligations. So that's the general framework. And human rights principles understand that public health emergencies are a legitimate basis for these kinds of restrictions. Whitney, can you go ahead and advance? So the fact that we haven't seen public emergencies being used to fight a global pandemic. We didn't see this scale during the height of the AIDS epidemic, but we are seeing it now. And we have the human rights system is structured to address this. So because states of emergencies are unfortunately a familiar feature in the human rights system, activists and scholars are and treaty bodies are used to used to evaluating states of emergencies and what to look for when there is a state of emergency. And the worry is that states are exceeding their authority in derogation, and the measures that they are applying are vague or overly broad. And the international human rights mechanism was alert to that at the beginning. So really it was about 10 days after the WHO declared this a global pandemic that the group of UN human rights experts issued a very strong statement that cautioned states against abusing states of emergency and cautioned them against using emergency powers in ways that could quash dissent. So that was already a worry at that point. And then just a few weeks after that, we have a very disturbing example from Hungary, where the parliament there passed emergency regulations that suspended and set aside acts of parliament, and did so without a sunset clause, meaning that there was no end date for this. And so that's an example of how governments can use the pandemic to change fundamental structures of governance that are very disconcerting for human rights situation going forward. Go ahead, Whitney, and advance the slide. So from the standpoint of the architecture of the human rights system, the problem is that we're seeing that states are not playing by the rules of international oversight and regulation for states of emergency. Now, again, this is through a treaty system that states are responsible for, that they agreed to. So the data that I'm using comes from an NGO that has been tracking states of emergency worldwide. And according to their data, they've counted 121 states with emergency restrictions. But what you're seeing is a state practice of restricting rights without going through the formal processes of declaring states of emergency, or they're declaring states of emergency, but they're not then filing the required notifications. So we see that almost 60% of the states that are derogating have declared a state of emergency, but haven't filed with the United Nations. And then there's another 30% that are restricting rights on an emergency basis, but haven't declared a state of emergency. And under international human rights law, it doesn't matter whether or not a state has formally declared or not formally declared from the standpoint of what are the standards of review that states need to comply with in order to be least restrictive of those particular limitations. And it's interesting that we have 13 states that actually have followed the procedures, right? They've declared a state of emergency and they filed a notification of derogation. And most of these are in Latin America, which Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Salvador, and Guatemala and Peru all followed it. The other big block is the former countries of the former Soviet Union. So we see there that the disturbing trend is that if what we're seeing now is a state practice where the norm is that states are restricting without formal derogation, then that becomes the new normal. So as Professor Linos said, when Greece closes its border before the pandemic really hits, and there's an outcry and critique and scrutiny, then under the pandemic, not only is Greece able to do it, everyone else is doing it too. And without any further discussion or scrutiny. And that's what's of concern. Whitney, go ahead and advance. So this next slide just gives a picture of the world. So every shade of blue is a state that is restricting rights. The gray area, and you'll notice there that China is in gray. It's not that it's not restricting, it's just that this database did not have data on China. So we can assume that more of the world is in blue than is not. And the reason why I wanted to show this is that the darkest blue states are states that are derogating, but that have not filed appropriate notice. And you'll see that those are all of the advanced industrialized countries, and then some. Now, just because a state has derogated doesn't mean that that the restrictions that it's put in place are illegal. Or if a state is restricting rights in an undeclared state of emergency, that the restrictions themselves are a violation. What the concern from a human rights, a structural human rights approach, is that you're seeing these global restrictions without buy-in from states to the global system of monitoring. And we've traditionally seen that the states that have been geopolitical allies in promoting human rights, right, Western, European, and advanced industrial states that have been the allies are the ones, in that sense, that are the worst offenders. And this raises a question of then who will be the states that are going to be allies and are going to lead on human rights in the midst of this crisis, and really importantly, beyond, right? Once the pandemic is over, what will be the state of human rights thereafter, and how do we establish, recalibrate rights enjoyment? Whitney, the next slide. Thanks. So what we're seeing right now is that the COVID epidemic comes on top of prior trends that have worsened the human rights situation around the world. So that's been brought about more recently by rising authoritarianism and popular nationalism that has seen governments adopting restrictions on funding for human rights work, and the work of many activists has been made more difficult. Now, the pandemic comes on top of this and has worsened this in a couple of ways. First of all, just some human rights activists are more vulnerable to COVID. So in that sense, think of political prisoners who were jailed before the pandemic and are now in prison and overcrowded and unsafe conditions. And we're seeing legal challenges to get them released because they're at risk to contract COVID in prison. Whether or not human rights bodies are going to be sympathetic and order the release is another question, but that's an illustration. One illustration. The second one is looking at indigenous rights activists or other community empowerment groups that are living in communities that are facing a particular problems due to the crisis, like reduced access to safe water, to food. And therefore, those communities are more vulnerable to contracting the disease. In addition, what we're seeing is that states are using emergency measures that they've adopted to fight COVID to, in fact, quash dissent. And we see in multiple countries, multiple regions, that governments are enacting fake news laws or false information. And they're using those, applying those laws to attack journalists or political opponents or human rights activists. So, for example, in Bolivia, there is an executive decree that was issued that says individuals who incite non-compliance or with this decree or cause uncertainty with regard to the population will be subject to criminal charges. It doesn't define those terms of causing uncertainty or what is misinformation, but you get clarity when the Interior Minister then orders the armed forces to, quote unquote, cyber patrol the internet to identify those who are misinforming the public and targeting them for prosecution. And those who are then named are political members of the political opposition. And so who have been accused of disseminating false information and may be subject to prosecution. So that's clearly a way to chill political speech. In China, you have reports of employees of the state-run television who quit his job and went to Wuhan to report on the coronavirus, took videos of labs and crematoria and funeral homes inside Wuhan to try and bring to light the scale of the epidemic as one of several public citizen journalists who were disappeared, arrested and then disappeared for publicizing information. In this particular case, he actually was live streaming his own arrest before the screen went blank. Another example is a human rights lawyer in Egypt who works with political prisoners. And he posted on Facebook a post calling for the release of political prisoners from the Torah prison, which is a notorious prison in Egypt. And for that work, he was then himself arrested and charged with joining a terrorist organization and spreading false news about the epidemic, was himself taken to that same prison. And because further regulation in the pandemic in Egypt is that lawyers do not have access to clients in prison, is being held then without access to a lawyer. A third way that states are restricting, are abusing human rights is using COVID to target LGBTI and other socially vulnerable groups. So in Uganda, the police raided a homeless shelter for LGBT youth and charged them with violating the shelter-in-place regulations, which prohibited gatherings of more than 10 people in public, right, in public. So the shelter, they were inside the shelter. The police raided the shelter and arrested 23 of them. They were put in prison and they were denied access to lawyers for 6 weeks. Just last week, the lawyers got in to interview their clients who reported that they had been taunted and discriminated within the prison. Some of them were HIV positive, and they were not able to access their medications because the guards would call out in the prison population, if there anyone here who is HIV positive, it's now time to go and get your medications. So the choice was to put a target on your back or to forego your access to essential medicines. So that's deeply problematic. And then finally, in the Philippines, there was a reported case of a police captain who forced 3 members of the LGBT community to perform lewd acts as a punishment for violating the curfew, and then posted a video of this punishment on social media. So we're seeing these reports. These are just a few that I wanted to highlight, again, in all regions of the world. And the question is, so what can human rights do to respond? What can human rights activists do? Go ahead, Whitney. Last slide. So I just wanted to highlight, because I want to make sure we get to questions. What are the tools of enforcement for international human rights. I think I wanted to really talk about three very briefly. So the first is what can the United Nations do? The special procedures, which are the independent United Nations experts, have, I think, a unique role to play in this moment. So they're called special rapporteurs. They're not state representatives of states, and they have traditionally taken the lead in sounding the alarm in human rights crises by issuing reports, by issuing press releases and statements. They are able to reiterate what the international human rights law is, but also important in these new and emergent situations of articulating how it applies and what should states be doing to promote and comply with their human rights obligations, and where states are stepping over the line. So we've already seen several statements have been issued, and I think that that's a place to watch. And hopefully you can also find governments stepping up and supporting and implementing the recommendations that are certainly going to be coming from that area. Now, strategic litigation is more difficult right now because human rights activists are themselves in lockdown and can't get out and do the normal kinds of investigation that we would need and expect in order to build those cases. Furthermore, in many countries, when you have a hostile government, the message is going out that you shouldn't do anything that's going to embarrass or criticize the government. And activists are saying that their normal escape routes are closed. As Professor Linos said, right? Borders are closed. So if you can't flee the country, if you can't file for asylum somewhere, then activists are really facing a quite constrained environment. And in these contexts, then looking for opportunities to file litigation outside the country before human rights monitoring bodies or human rights institutions, and relying on groups that are outside the country and are able to file those pleadings, I think is something that activists are talking about. And then finally, national efforts, right? There are countries that do have a more independent judiciary where challenges can be filed and human rights obligations can be asserted. And I think there we're looking for ways, I think, to see, can international law and these standards be brought to bear more immediately? Because oftentimes before a piece of litigation gets to an international court, it may first spend months, if not years, being litigated in domestic court. So those are also some of the things that the clinic is involved with in talking to activists. So we're trying to light a candle in the darkness. So thank you. I'm going to stop there. Whitney, you can go to the last slide. And yes, we look forward to questions. Thank you.
All right, excellent. So if you have a question, you can please feel free to send it to me in the chat, or if you'd like to ask the question directly out loud, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. I do have a question already. Could Professor Linos explain or mention again the limitations of international traveling with a green card versus being a US citizen?
Sure, I'd be more than happy to. When I also saw Professor Volp, who is, of course, our immigration law expert, so she might want to add or correct to that. So in general, states have allowed for their nationals and permanent residents to be repatriated. So if you are right now a green card holder outside of the United States, you can travel in as well as a national, even though physically there are going to be all kinds of problems. But the legal, it is harder for this administration to put in place restrictions on green card holders, even though it tried. So it tried to put restrictions on green card holders, starting with like version 1.0 of the Muslim ban. But I believe that there are provisions in both the INA and in international law, which would make that problematic. For all practical purposes, if you're a green card holder and you're thinking of traveling outside of the United States, there is a little bit of reason to worry. One of them being that you might be stuck outside for more than 6 months, and the second being that you never know what this administration will try. But my belief is that in general, residents, meaning permanent residents, green card holders, and citizens are protected and will be able to re-enter this country should they leave.
Professor Volpe, you wanted to?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I was just going to say, I just jumped in the chat. Apologies, I've missed everything. But I was going to say, I saw that Anil Kalhan is actually on the call. He's a visiting scholar at CSLS, a law professor at Drexel, who has been tweeting about green card restrictions. So I actually thought maybe Professor Kalhan might want to say something.
Sure, Professor Kalhan, hold on, let me unmute you. If you have anything, good, yeah.
I actually don't have a whole lot to add to what Professor Linos had to say. I mean, there are limitations on the ability of the statutory authority of the president to restrict, certainly within the United States, the ability of people to become permanent residents. But then people who already have green cards are consistently treated differently under the immigration laws as both a statutory and constitutional matter. But that having been said, I fully endorse what Professor Linos is saying about the hazards, even before the pandemic, for people who have green cards, the hazards of trying to return to the United States under these circumstances, if someone were to get stuck or if they were deemed not to be essential travelers in returning across a land border, for example, there could be complications.
So aside from the reports that can be submitted to the UN, what else can be done to enforce the existing human rights framework? Meaning, what are the consequences for non-compliance?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it depends on where you are and what the opportunities are. So first and foremost, your local, state, national officials are responsible for protecting your rights. And so what I'm calling international human rights is, is one mechanism for doing that. But we're seeing challenges in domestic courts under domestic law that are also protecting human rights. So I want to leave that aside. But when we're talking about what are the international mechanisms for doing that, compliance and enforcement looks a little bit different. And that's, Professor Linos has written a lot about this. And so what that in particular looks like. The human rights in general, the human rights treaties, states, they have to report every 4 years. In addition, for those states that have accepted special jurisdiction, individuals can file petitions before human rights treaty bodies for adjudication, declaratory judgments about their rights. Regional human rights courts tend to be much stronger and therefore harder to get to. Because those human rights courts can actually issue binding orders to states. And so the European Court of Human Rights is one that does have the jurisdiction and the ability to make, to adjudicate whether or not particular emergency measures are complying with the Regional Human Rights Treaty. The problems there are that the requirement to exhaust your domestic remedies, meaning you first have to go through national courts, can take a very long time. And so we may not see those cases ripen in the international system for 5 or 6 years unless a party can show that that they are meet one of the standards to be excused from exhausting domestic remedies. So the other kinds of challenges then go to the more naming and shaming, documenting abuses by states, garnering international attention, a conversation within the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. In very dire circumstances, you might imagine that there would be a conversation at the UN Security Council. So far, the US has blocked the COVID from coming up as an agenda item at the UN Security Council, again, over what Professor Linos talked about, which is a disagreement about how the WHO is being characterized in that body. So one of the things that's very disconcerting in this at this moment is that what had been more friendly fora to raise human rights issues are not so friendly right now, and that's that's an area of concern when so much of what we see about compliance is garnering an international consensus that states need to comply because they don't want to be seen or be called out as violators are not the conditions. We don't have the right conditions for that mechanism to operate in the same way. But Professor Linos, you might have some other things to add on that.
Dean Chemerinsky, you had a question?
Me too. Thank you both for a terrific presentation. This isn't the first pandemic, though the first of this scope in a century. Are there parts of international law that can be traced back to other pandemics and epidemics? And do you think that this pandemic is going to cause a change in particular aspects of international law for the future?
So maybe I'll add a note of optimism that might or might not be well-founded. So the last pandemic we talk about a lot is the flu of 1918. It's called the Spanish flu because at the time, the press in all the countries that were fighting World War II was not reporting on it. So Spain just happened to be neutral and thus the association, but our entire system of international institutions was not in place at the time. So out of the crisis that was World War II, we had a new set of institutions. My expectation is that we're going to have a new set of institutions. There have been efforts to reform the World Health Organization several times. So the World Health Organization in the time of the Cold War was very much divided over kind of the role of socialized medicine versus other types of insurance. So the most controversial thing the World Health Organization did in 1978 was to promote the Almada Declaration prioritizing primary care. Now that was probably the right idea, very controversial at the time. Ideas that were also controversial, such as lists of essential medications, are now being adopted by insurance providers. So there's more recently, there have been two efforts to go around the World Health Organization. One of them was the Global Fund. The other one was Gavi. Again, kind of the thought was that the World Health Organization was too slow, too bureaucratic, and too distant from the pharmaceutical industry. So a big debate was whether in order to move quickly to eliminate malaria, tuberculosis, and other types of plagues, we needed private-public partnerships. We needed alliances with the pharmaceutical industry, which the WHO is very hostile to. So my view is that there was money to be spent that was not going to the WHO, that we experimented with these alternatives for about a decade and saw that money was not the only issue, that there were some advantages to working from an within an international organization framework. Some of them are obvious to non-lawyers. They have to do with flexibility, with who has control. Is it a group of donor states, or is it a large number of developing countries? And there's a key legal advantage, immunity, that these public-private partnerships have also wanted to benefit from. So because we tried that in the last decade, and because there are a lot of states that want to donate money, my hope is that out of this pandemic, there will be transformation. Since the international health regulations, we've much more successfully fought off the other declared pandemics. So I mentioned SARS, but H1N1, the polio, flu that we don't even remember, every other announcement of a pandemic was successfully addressed. I believe that out of this massive failure, there will be some opportunity for regrowth and greater coordination in the global sphere.
So I have a note of caution about that, as well as a note of optimism, not on the pandemic. I guess my note of caution is, at least what we've seen so far has been we have seen the global pandemic not galvanize consensus, but in fact we've seen it politicize the pandemic and only kind of reinforce the tendencies to move away from an international system of government, not towards cooperation. I think that Professor Linos correctly points out there are good reasons, and I hope that we see areas where we're going to see increased cooperation. But I'm concerned that what we're seeing is that this is sort of a perfect storm for popular nationalist regimes and authoritarian regimes to give each other cover to do what is in their short-term self-interest to maintain power. And if successful, it's going to make it very difficult for the conditions for political opposition to challenge this new set of regulations. Now, the positive point is, I think that we've also seen prior to COVID, a growing attention to international inequality and the political legal economy that reproduces that. And I think that the COVID pandemic is exacerbating those trends. And so that to me is the opportunity. So for example, when European states have limited the economic adverse impacts of COVID on their populations by supplying income support in ways that the United States has not, is that going to make it more politically palatable, or a necessity that other states are going to increase a safety net? And can we recoup some of the losses of the last 40 years of disinvestment? I think that's an open opportunity. Open question. Finally, we have very particular social movements that I think can be strengthened in this moment. For example, the movement for decarceration. Under COVID, right, you're seeing in the United States, this is taking the form of release of certain groups of prisoners on humanitarian grounds. Whether or not that gets taken up and expanded in other contexts, I don't know. But there's a way in which the particular crisis puts into sharp relief a background of human rights hostile actions by government, and may generate the political pressure from below to reverse course. So how that gets taken up at the international question, at the international level, I think remains to be seen.
I think we've got time for at least one more. I was wondering if either of you could talk a little bit more about restrictions on alleged misinformation about COVID.
So the restriction, I mean, what I've been seeing in terms of tracking the reports about many countries have enacted these, essentially criminalizing speech by labeling it criminalizing misinformation about COVID, but that has been interpreted by prosecutors and police as misinformation is information that calls into question the strength of the government's response on COVID. And so we haven't yet seen those. So these are now at the stage of people, opponents being charged or being investigated. We haven't seen those being challenged in the court, and how domestic courts, let alone international courts, are going to rule on those. But I think that's an area where international UN experts ought to be making a statement and reinforcing what are the international permissible restrictions on freedom of speech, and where misinformation, criminalizing misinformation, what the boundaries are for specificity and proportionality.
We can sneak another one in. From the international law perspective, in the event of the creation of a vaccine, who would be responsible for deciding if the vaccine is going to be universal, or who would have access to it and priority?
So this is debated today at the World Health Organization Assembly. There is an effort by the NGO Oxfam to underscore how critical it would be that all government leaders, or a large number of them, commit to universal access. There's at least two questions here. One has to do with patent protection, whether kind of given that all pharmaceuticals are relatively easy to manufacture once they have been discovered, whether anyone would be able to recoup the research costs. And to me, that problem seems easier to solve, easier to agree to. The idea that all the vaccines will not enjoy full patent protections or will receive some kind of subsidy from governments of rich countries, than the question of manufacturing and distribution. So there, the idea that we have a system in which a handful of countries manufacture the vaccines, and those countries, including, for example, India, in addition to Western countries, have committed to vaccinating their citizens first, that to me raises big problems, even if there is this global pledge that we have global distribution. At the same time, the good thing about vaccines is that they're one of the most cost-effective innovations in medicine or in any other field. So to the extent kind of this discovery stage proceeds well, and there were good news this morning, there seem to be ways to expand production and efforts, again, kind of from private public partnerships with pharmaceutical companies, with foundations, to establish global distribution. Similarly, it's one of these areas, infectious diseases, in which we've had global cooperation, because unlike other causes of death, if Ebola or some other disease is now killing off people in some very remote part of the Congo, until that disease is eradicated, there is a threat globally. My hope is that quickly after the discovery of the vaccine, it will be globally distributed. And there's some reason for optimism, despite the rhetoric of the government of the United States, the governments of some European countries, the government of India, and others.